Hey, good morning. 10:01. Let's rock and roll. Welcome to the Hammerdown Podcast, where we put the pedal to the metal and talk trends, tech, and tunes. My name is Jay Mervis, Senior Director of Healthcare Sales here at Fortinet. Today, I've got an absolute legend in the business today on the podcast. I've got Phil Englert. He's the VP of Med Device Security from Health ISAC. Phil, good morning. Welcome aboard. How are you?
Hey, good morning, Jay. I'm doing wonderful, and thanks for inviting me to be here today. Really looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, one of the biggest trends that we're seeing in the industry is medical device security and how we do that. So, Phil, I would love for you to introduce yourself, your role at Health ISAC, and what your background is, and then we're going to get into talking trends, tech, and tunes about medical device security.
Great. So I'm a clinical engineer. I started out fixing medical devices, actually fixing clinical diagnostic stuff in the lab. So as a field service engineer working for Fisher Scientific and instrumentation labs, ran all up and down the West Coast, from Spokane to San Diego, fixing devices. I had no idea what they even looked like. I'd have to look them up in a catalog so I wouldn't walk past them in the lab, the next day. I would have to ask technicians, when you first come in the morning, what do you do? And they would reach behind and they'd hit the power switch. And I'm like, okay, now I know how to turn this thing on, So it was a great experience. I worked on a tremendous variety of equipment. I was in a lot of different environments, from diagnostic labs, clinical labs in hospitals to research labs for major manufacturers and startups, to dental clinics and the back office stuff. So really great experience. Really love that. Got out of field service engineering and started managing healthcare biomed programs in hospitals. So got exposure to the rest of the healthcare technology, the diagnostic imaging stuff, the patient monitoring, the infusion pumps, all the rest of that, right? And this was, back in the 80s and early 90s, before all of this stuff was really connected. That the big risk back then was electrical shock. A lot of these big pieces of equipment, might have had 480 volts in tunable coils, and they're in a wet environment. So the risk was really electrical hazards, right? Equipment has evolved so much since then. It's been really great to watch its evolution, but the technology's gotten smaller, it's gotten smarter, it's got so much more capable. And in that, it also got interoperable, and with that, we created a lot of risks that at first we weren't aware of. I was in this business, during the plug and play era. Clinicians were saying, hey, I'm doing really great stuff, I want to share this with everybody. Administration was like, I want to build efficiencies into my system, so we need to share information across systems. We figured out ways to make stuff talk, even if it didn't talk the same language, we put translators in place, whether it was HL7 or other translation languages. So we built this great community of information sharing, not realizing we were painting a target on our back as an industry, right? So we created all of this great data. We were using it for good things. And then the bad actors got, into the idea that, hey, this is valuable stuff. We can use it. We can use it and leverage it to our advantage. So I was working for a large healthcare organization. I was at the top of their organization doing their benchmarking for their operations, for their maintenance operations, for clinical engineering, for facilities management. And our CISO came and said, what do we know about medical device security? And the answer was not a damn thing. So that started me on that journey. I partnered with our IT security lead, to come up with an assessment tool so we could understand which of our 500,000 devices were connected. We knew many of them were. We just didn't have an organizational oversight as to which ones were connected, which controls were available, and what was our organizational discipline around applying those controls. And so that really started me on the journey. I started working with the FDA. I got involved with MDIS. I got involved with standards committees. I got involved with HISAC. as a customer, as a member of HISAC, and really that learning was grassroots at the time. It was very much, a lot of people were doing a lot of different things. I got plugged into as much of it as I possibly could, and built a program for that large healthcare organization. Actually, the way they were organized, I built 7 programs for them.
Wow.
One of the things that I realized was, I approached it from a framework perspective, right?
Sure.
It used to be every time a new cybersecurity incident came out, right? Our director of IT security would go into Chicken Little mode. The sky is falling. One patient incident is too much, And I said, we've been
Right.
accepting this risk for a long time. Let's be a little bit more rational about it, right? A lot of these devices aren't controlled. We're not going to get an update like on Patch Tuesday, So the normal IT processes weren't working, and we had to adapt what we were doing so that we could understand the risk and then manage that risk, whether it was to accept it, whether it was to put this device or this group of devices on our strategic replacement plan, because the risk was too much, whether it was to slow roll technology that was patient positive but had a lot of risks in there. And we would negotiate with manufacturers about, hey, we'll adopt your technology, but we're not going to do it all at once, right? We'll make
Yeah.
a commitment to you, you make a commitment to us to improve it, so that as we expand your product base in our environment, the risk is diminishing because you're installing more controls that limit that risk for us. So we
Yeah.
really like that partnership mode in that.
Yeah.
And so all of that, that was 30 years in there, and I retired, did a couple of interim things, and then found myself at Health ISAC as their leader for medical device security. Having worked with manufacturers, having been in a large healthcare delivery organization, gave me a view into both sides of the fence, understanding the challenges that manufacturers had with designing security into their devices and supporting security in their devices once they're fielded. And the same thing on the flip side, understanding the challenges and the limitations that healthcare delivery organizations have with securing their devices and doing that. So my approach really was to make this a maintenance operations thing. Cyber is a failure mode, right? And in that mode changes, right? So if we think about how these devices can fail from cyber, then we can anticipate and plan for responses. If I lose a CT tube if I lose a tube in a CT, right? I know where I'm buying it from, how long it's going to take to land on my dock,
Mhm.
how long it's going to take me to install it and calibrate it, and when I can return that device to service. So if I lose the hard drive, right, I don't have that. I might go back to 30 disks that the manufacturer have and want to rebuild that. But why not think about, how do I get this thing back in service better? Why don't I ghost that drive, clean off the PHI, re-ghost it, so I have a pristine drive that's a recovery system. Then if I get ransomed or if I get malware on my device, I can pull that out. I can give it to the forensics team. They can do
Right.
their job, and I can put this device back in service, right? And we can continue to provide patient care, because that's the mission of what we do.
Right. Right. So it's interesting that your background is similar to what mine was. I grew up on the infrastructure and point of care side. When the Obama administration went through the digitization of medical records, it was put compute in the bedside. You talk about, these devices are in water environments, right? Or the risk is that you have an electrical device. We had to sell UL 60601 certified surge protectors because you can't burn down an OR. And then, some of what you're talking about, and I want to go back to the 500,000 devices. So some of our analysis is per bed in a hospital, there's between 12 and 15 devices. Nurses still have between 1 and 5.7 devices on their belt. So when you extrapolate that out of a major health system, when we talk to Health ISAC, because we at Fortinet partner with Health ISAC, that's how we got connected, Phil. But what are some of the best practices about awareness, creating this with the medical device manufacturers in securing this space?
So one of the big reveals, I think, early in my development was manufacturers thought that their responsibility often ended with the confines of the box, right? And
Mhm.
they didn't think about the impact that that box had on patient care delivery. And in the early days when I'm working with manufacturers, they would be like, how would I know that?
Yeah.
And rightly so. I mean, healthcare networked ecosystems are as varied as the medical device population itself, right? This is one of the challenges. A large healthcare system, right, we had 500,000 devices, 100,000 of them were connected. So about 20%, were connected. Many of them very old, had been connected for ages, right? But of that, right, of that 100,000 devices, there's maybe 20 manufacturers that made up about 80% of that device count, right? So the important thing, right, is really to understand the challenges that your install base has, right, and then how you can address that. You have to chunk it out. We can't solve it all at once. We talk about medical devices like they're chairs in a room and they all do the same thing, but that's not the case at all, right?
Totally
There's
not true.
hundreds of functionality, right? The FDA has about 500 plus product codes for connected medical devices. They've got about 6,000, 6,800, I think, product codes for that. But that includes Band-Aids and tongue depressors and,
Sure.
all that stuff, right? But when we talk about connected medical devices, there are about 500 products, right? And that has several hundred functions involved. So the spectrum. And so I say that because the underlying technology that supports all of that clinical functionality is just as varied. So there's no cure-all for this. You have to break it down into sections, into chunks that are manageable, and address the chunks, as they need to be addressed. You do that within a framework, right? So what I encourage healthcare organizations to do is look at, in each department, what are the critical devices, for delivering that department's mission, right? The ER is different than the OR, is different than the ICU, right? So you have to go to those business leaders and say, if you lost this device, could you still do your job? And if the answer is no, then you better have a response plan. You need to think, how can this device fail for cyber, and what am I going to do about it, right? If I lose my CT, am I going to bring in a trailer, right? And who's that supplier, and how soon can they get it here,
Yeah.
right? So you just have to think about, how do I continue to deliver healthcare? That's the real thing, right? And then you can think
Yeah.
about the risks that these devices have on them, right? And what can I do to mitigate those risks, right? Can I offload PHI that is stored in 5 other places in different systems and not keep
Mhm.
it on a less secure medical device, right? So can I do things to reduce the risk to my organization? So even if it does get ransomed, right, I may not go into a publicly notifiable breach situation, right? Because I've lost my CT, right? All that data is elsewhere. We don't need it on the medical devices itself. We can begin to isolate devices, right? Infusion pumps should be on their own isolated, wireless network, right? They don't need to connect with anything else. Nothing else talks to them. They just talk to their management system. They get their drug library updates, and they function just fine. By intelligently sectioning off your systems, right, to what they need to talk to, you can reduce the blast radius if anything goes wrong, right? And so we have to think about that. These are
Yeah.
not without cost, though, right? So
Sure.
it's expensive to section networks. It's expensive to administrate them. The tools out in place, and we'll talk about that earlier or
So,
later
so
on.
that that's what I was going to ask you, Phil. Is what does somebody do from a provider perspective? What is Health ISAC, and from your purview, what do they recommend? Getting visibility into those medical devices to know what's out there and if it's functioning correctly. You talk about segmentation and having all of the infusion pumps or IV pumps on one piece of the network. How does somebody go about that from where you sit when you get the calls at Health ISAC?
Yeah, so one of the challenges of a lot of your medical devices, right? And a lot of them are very small frameworks with very limited computing capability, right? But that doesn't mean that they don't have multiple communications capabilities. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's vulnerabilities there. Passive monitoring tools over the last decade have really matured, right? These devices can't take traditional, you can't put an agent on it so the device, phones into your network and reports its status on a periodic basis. So the passive monitoring tools are great. People are getting, really smart at being able to identify, the devices themselves, classify and identify what they are. The correlation to the other data systems, right? This is one of the big challenges in healthcare is you have multiple stakeholders responsible for different portions of a medical device, clinical engineering or health technology management as they're often called. They're responsible for the operations, making sure the device turns on and does what it's supposed to do, right? So they keep it on, right? IT is responsible for keeping it talking. IT security is responsible for monitoring what it's talking to and identifying anything out, right? These folks all have specialty management systems that often, use different identifiers, right? So being able to correlate it so that when you and I have a conversation, we know we're talking about absolutely the same device and we
Right.
can respond accordingly. You can do your job, I can do my job, and we can be much more effective, as opposed to, right? I used to get calls from our IT security saying, hey, we found this IP. It's got a standard or default credential on it that we should be changing, and oh, by the way, it looks like there might be 200 of these devices. And I'm like, oh, and I happen to have one of those IPs in my data set. I'm like, yep, I've got 200 of those devices. I know exactly what they are. I can then talk to the manufacturer, say, hey, we want to change these credentials. How do we do that in a way that doesn't cripple your service operations or cripple our service operations, right? So there's a lot of stakeholders, including third-party service, whether it's the manufacturer or another independent service organization that's maintaining these devices.
Yeah. So Phil, on that note, what are some of the current and most prevalent threats that people might not be thinking about that you're seeing when you get feedback from the Health ISAC community and your network of folks?
So probably what we hear about the most is ransomware, right? It is the most common form of attack against healthcare, right? And they go in through phishing attacks or smishing attacks or whaling or however they're gaining credential against these systems. They get into them, they sit and they migrate out, become pervasive throughout the system, and then launch the attack. Oftentimes, a medical device is not recognizable as a medical device. When you're on the wire, it just looks like a Windows box or it looks like a Linux box. And so when you then launch your attack, when these attacks are launched or the data is encrypted and these devices are no longer available to do what they're supposed to do. A couple years ago in Germany, right, at Dusseldorf University, there was a woman that was having a cardiac event, right? In the ambulance, they determined that the Dusseldorf hospital was under a ransom attack. They couldn't accept her. They put her on divert. They drove her 20, I think it was like 20 miles, 30 clicks, I think.
Yep.
In that time, she passed away, right? I mean, it was just, and it was interesting. The folks that launched the ransomware attack had no idea that they could impact patient care. They actually got conscientious and gave the keys back and restored that. There was, concern that this was the first time we caused a death, right? In that, under, the clinical or the medical review, they determined that the patient would have expired regardless of where she ended up, right? So that wasn't the first time that a ransomware attack or a medical device was crippled by a cyber event, right? Prevent or caused patient death. A couple of years later in Alabama, a mother went in scheduled for pre-delivery, right? The hospital was under a ransomware attack. They were not able to monitor the patient, the TOCO monitors at the central station, and there was fetal distress. They went to emergency C-section. There were challenges with that, and while the infant was born alive, subsequently passed away, right? And so this was a time there are folks that think, or people that say, well, the hospital should have had processes in place. This really wasn't that. But what my point is that when you attack healthcare, right, there are so many medical devices that you have no idea what you could be impacting, that you can very much cripple the ability to do that. Dr. Christian DeMeth out at UC San Diego has been looking at that. They know that there's a tail on this, right, for clinical delivery, and his latest report, right, so there's a tail. So the clinical outcomes, right, are impacted for a period of 12 to 18 months after a ransomware attack, because the hospital is distracted doing other activities to recover for this. Be cautious about this, right? His latest study shows that ransom in one hospital being crippled, right, impacts clinical care in other community hospitals around that facility, because of now they have to absorb that extra patient load, right? Very often hospitals are sized and spaced by certificates of needs determined by the state departments of health, right? So that's all, it's all interrelated. It's all very complex.
Right, and they're staffed accordingly, and when they take so much overflow, nobody gets good. The care delivery breaks down at some level at some point. So,
right, absolutely.
One last thing, Phil, that I want to ask is, what do the community at Health ISAC? I just love the group there. There's so many good people that contribute, whether it's from our end or from you guys cheering, or from the community of providers and medical device manufacturers and insurers that are all make this up. What is something that we're going to be doing in the future that's going to improve how this looks for patient care?
So maybe it's too early to go into details, but my focus is on exposing the risks around specific medical devices. We have ransomware, which I think acts like an umbrella to shield, the greater community. We don't have, actuarial data on medical devices being crippled by viruses, malware, ransomware, so on and so forth. So I'm working on a couple of initiatives to bring light to that, right? To be able to quantify it, right? Because once we can quantify it, then, the folks that are responsible for managing these risks then have some tools to go out and get the resourcing needed, right? Get the support from the executive levels on either the manufacturing side or the healthcare delivery side, right? There's that. The FDA calls it shared responsibility. I like to call it declared responsibility, right? You do this, I do that, right? I mean, we both have a role. That's the shared part. But if I think you're going to do something and you think I'm doing that very same thing, it's not getting done, and we've gapped that. So the smarter thing to do is say, here's what needs to be done. Let's negotiate who has the capacity and the competency and the resourcing to do those. And whether it falls on you, whether it falls on me, whether we engage a third party to do that, we just have to figure out how that's going to be done. So that's there. And then I talked about, that these are really, cyber is a failure mode, right? I get annoyed with the vulnerability. Chasing vulnerabilities is like swatting flies, right? You kill one, 10 more show up to its funeral. It seems like a never ending task, right? So the real thing is being able to understand which devices are important. And then when there's a vulnerability on there, you are in a better position to assess whether this is something you need to spend your scarce resources on immediately, to make sure that your organization is as resilient as possible.
Awesome. So yeah, Phil, all great content, and I appreciate your level of depth on what the medical device security trend and your involvement in this. Being one of the people that's planting the flag up the mountain. Like I said, my original cutting my teeth in the healthcare business was on point of care. Huge impact, because the digitization and the patient envelope and all the stuff we had to know back in 2003, 4, and 5 turns to today, to when we're going to move this over. The impact of the medical device business and securing that, whether it's on the provider side or on the medical device when it shows up at the customer side. Let's talk about technology on here. I think that this is the most impactful thing that might happen here in the phase 3 or 5 or whatever this is of my career. But how does integrating or embedding security controls into medical devices impact patient safety with the technology?
So cyber safety is patient safety. That's rule one, right? That's the whole resilience piece, and we need to get there, right? The FDA, through the omnibus bill, has been granted statutory authority over cybersecurity for the first time. There was not always that direct link between a cyber event and a safety impact, right? We knew the two were interrelated, but it was difficult to always to measure those. Now that the FDA has purview over cyber safety, right, and cybersecurity, right, and the omnibus put in three things, right? They have to be built, the devices have to be built within a secure development framework, right? So they have to demonstrate that they're clinically effective and that they've got a reasonable, attempt or a reasonable build to be cyber secure, right? They have to have a post-market monitoring process. So they have to monitor the environment for new things and respond to those, right? And so that's another thing. And then they also have to have the software bill of materials, or the SBOM, right, and provided with that. The FDA is also coming out with, it's had a couple of versions of pre-market guidance in place, and we expect that to be finalized later this year, hopefully as early as late December, and that should, form, or provide better detail around that. The FDA has declared that cyber is a quality issue, right? If your device can be made not to do what it's supposed to do or to do unexpected things, then that's a quality issue, right? And so it falls into good manufacturing practices to have solid code, the ability to detect, nefarious activity, and the ability to fail safely, right? And have the program in place to monitor for that, respond to that, and close that loop, right?
So when we talk software bill of materials, one of my questions was, how is this going to be used, and will customers on either side use this? Sounds to me like with the FDA and the legislation, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is here and it's going to be, something that's going to move the industry forward.
It is. I think it really is, right? So this is more, it's transparency, right? It's like what's in here, right? And I think initially, manufacturers will have a bigger bolus of movement from this, right? They'll understand all of the components in their products. They'll be able to monitor for risk. They'll be able to respond to them, right? Initially, I think HDOs will use them to assess, how these products are built that they're considering bringing into their environment. And remember, we have to balance, the clinical benefits, the operational, efficiencies that are gained from new technologies, right? As well as the cybersecurity risks and the physical risks of bringing these devices into our environment, right? So it's one of many elements, but understanding what those risks are, what those exposures are, leads you to having better conversations with your manufacturers, perhaps negotiating with them to build, improve security controls as time goes on, so that you can gain the clinical benefits, right? And then manage the cyber risks as they come into your environment on that. So I think those are two things, right? It will take us a little while for consumers to really use those on a response play, right? So this device is out there. There are a lot of things, a lot of vulnerabilities that come out that have generally understood to have broad attribution, or broad applicability, but limited attribution. Log4j was one of those, right? But we were better with Log4j than we were with Heartbleed, right? And so we'll continue to evolve with that. So those, I think, will initially be the piece. The real thing with medical devices, right, is oftentimes the code or the vulnerability may not have an impact on functionality of the device, clinical functionality of the device. If I can gain elevated credentials, right? Does that mean I can change therapies, or I can turn the printer on and off? So
or does it mean I can exfiltrate an entire database with PHI and sell it?
Exactly, right? Or can I get lateral movement out of this device, right, and use it as a
Right.
pivot? So great point. But the thing is, we have to understand, what does the exploit allow us to do? I don't think CVE is a good way to do that because it evaluates the risk to the component itself. It doesn't evaluate the risk within the product that is in. And we have to solve that. That's one of the things that we have to do. And that's why I always talk to healthcare delivery organizations and manufacturers alike about understanding the impact, on the clinical functionality and the clinical mission, right? So
Yeah.
it's not just, I mean, there's one thing to say this device won't work. It's another thing to say I can no longer provide healthcare, in this aspect or this aspect of healthcare.
Yeah, that disruption to care delivery. And, we're doing a lot of work, Phil. We've got a nice roster of provider customers, whether it's enterprise, rural health, somebody between. And we've been very engaged in this market for, before I got here, I've been here 2.5 years, but when we talk to customers, patient safety is number one. So at Fortinet, we've got the ability, because we're a manufacturing driven organization first. So we spend a ton of time developing products that go and outperform our competitors. And some of the medical device manufacturers we have as customers, some of what you're talking about is, okay, they've identified a vulnerability. How fast do we remediate this? We talk about a health system that you ran that had 500,000 devices. You start extrapolating that across the country and, pick the top 40 OEMs that make up 80% of the market. There's not enough field techs that are out there to go fix all this stuff. So we automate within our Fortinet fabric the ability to go and communicate with those devices, in sync or offline with our Fortinet extender. But we've got flexibility multiple ways, whether it's our FortiGate inline. So a couple of our marquee customers that we're not compromising some of the biggest healthcare events that have happened over the last 3 years. That marquee customer, strict IPS list, they're constantly maintaining and managing that. But you talk about the FDA and legislation, when somebody goes and develops a product and they have 3 years of regression testing, whatever it's Microsoft at the beginning of 3 years, that's what's out in the field. Right. So we have the ability to protect that with our, EDR, because we can roll back multiple versions and protect on that. We've got a one-to-many formula. So we talked to a major OEM the other day and said, hey, these devices and modalities, and we've got 5 million devices or 50 million, I can't remember the number, but they service everybody else's stuff because they're showing up at the hospital. They don't do everything. And so if they can go one-to-many and protect with our FortiGates back to the cloud, they want to consume all that data. And there's certain other things right now to where there's, heart monitors, right? Nobody wants that to get compromised and stop a heartbeat for somebody that they're monitoring their heart. If we're embedding our security controls within the autonomous vehicles and within some of the low orbit satellites, we can for sure figure out with our value-added resellers how to do this with some of the major medical device manufacturers. So very cool times with what the technology is. We're young enough to remember like 6 or 7 years ago, I did a couple of security audits and assessments in my last role, and all the Windows XP and Windows NT and Windows 95 that were coming up was because those devices, you think about a physician wants a glue commander, or they want a breath test that's going to be consistent from when somebody comes in 2002 till today. And if they change those variables, they don't know if you're getting better or worse off your baseline. So we've seen a ton of those devices, and I can remember getting calls like serial ports were going the way of the dinosaurs circa 2007. People wanted serial ports to get the glue commanders because they needed that for the testing with, a fleet of devices they had for diabetes. So
Right.
It's wild times right now, Phil, and there's good things going on that we're going to go drive the industry forward, and I'm really excited about it. So.
It is, and I envy the position that companies like Fortinet are in, because they get exposed, right, to a broader base of products and a broader base of customers, right, than just either the customer. That was one of the visions one of the learnings I had, once I left the healthcare organization and started in some of these other roles, working with other healthcare organizations. Was there other ways? There's other things, right? So I had the world according to what I knew, and then I had the world according to others, right? And you see that world according to others from both sides of the fence, and those learnings can help really accelerate, the advances there. And as I said, I envy that. We lean into, as Health ISAC, we lean into that experience and that exposure to help educate, our members. And that's a wonderful thing. The sharing that goes on in this organization is phenomenal. We say that we're an organization of 8,000 analysts working for you, because that's the way it is. I mean, and I see it every day where folks are asking questions, and not just about security, right? But about tools, about policies, about practices. How are we doing this? When GPT and large language models came out, people were like, what are we doing? How do I do this? And we spun up a group. They came together, folks that have done research, shared that out, got some best thinking, right, to accelerate and amplify the impact, on the entire community. And that's it's an invaluable thing. I've never seen anything like it, and I'm proud to be part of it.
Yeah, and I'm so proud that we're part of it as well, Phil. The other thing that is one thing you touched on is that from an IDN or health delivery organization, regardless of their size, the cybersecurity community is great that it all comes together, that you could draw from. It's probably one of the best networks you can have, but with the resource constraints that everybody is probably under indexed for what they need for, everybody that's in the healthcare provider business is doing it for the greater cause of, providing care. But having the community that you can go, if somebody says, is your glass half full or glass half empty? I'm like, well, just order another round. I don't really care what the difference is. But when we talk through this is, if the legislation is going to force the medical device manufacturers to say, okay, we'll go and automate all this and we'll protect this. We've shown, partnering with Fortinet, we've done A, B, and C better than anybody else, because this hospital system was down for 7 weeks, but they still had diagnostic equipment. Now, they couldn't do anything else, but that diagnostic equipment, if that risk gets reduced by the medical device manufacturers concerned about patient safety, can go deliver this. That's one of those huge wins for the industry that we're going to move the industry forward. So,
right.
Exciting times, Phil. I always love, going into something and kind of like a NASCAR wreck, to where you don't know if you're going to get through the other side. There's a lot of smoke and there's flags and sirens and stuff going on, but I think we're going to go and, continue this journey down. Want to transition over to my favorite part of the show, Phil, unless you got any other final thoughts on the technology for us.
I'm good. Yeah, let's move on.
So, hey, my favorite part of the show, we're going to talk tunes today. It's like corporate Christmas for me. Let's like open up a new package. We're going to go in. Phil, you're the guest. Led Zeppelin's the band today. Phil, what do you love about Led Zeppelin, and why did you pick Led Zeppelin for medical device security?
So I'll tell you, Led Zeppelin is the first band I connected with as a kid. I can remember doing homework on one of those fold down phonographs, right, that I actually got from a school system. So it was appropriate I'm doing homework to this, right? But I would just listen to the first 4 albums of Led Zeppelin over and over again as I'm trying to study. I don't know how effective it was, but I certainly enjoyed it. And I think Led Zeppelin really is an innovation, right? And I think that's what we need. When I think about what's going on, right, we're in a very innovative space, right? I mean, I remember walking in and saying, are you kidding me? This is a technology exists and somebody uses this every day, and that was 30 years ago, and it's still true today. I mean, I cannot believe when I review what's being approved by the FDA, I mean, they're now using a water pick essentially to do cancer ablations, right, to have less impact. I mean, who'd have thought? We went through everything from high energy, to ultrasound, and now we're using something as natural as water to ablate and destroy cancer cells in bodies. And I love that innovation. And stepping over to the cyber side, it's the same thing. It's the innovation of that, right? And I think, Led Zeppelin was one of those bands that was known for borrowing from a lot of different things, whether it was, Middle Earth, and the stories there, right, or the Celtic or the Celtic lore of old, right? So, but they borrowed that and then morphed it, or even just the early blues coming out of the Mississippi Delta, of that, and then they morphed it into something and made it their own. And I think from a cyber approach, that's what we have to do, right? We have to look at what's old, right, and then think about how it can be applied in new ways. I think this is what hackers do on a daily basis. They take tools that exist and they're like, if I could do something new, can I get a different result, right? And so that's the same sort of morphology that Led Zeppelin brought to, the rock and roll world, at the time. So I
For
love
sure. 9 studio albums, highly influential. My generation, grew up with it. John Bonham was dead before I was born, but Guns N' Roses, Stone Temple Pilots, Foo Fighters, Nirvana. There's a whole genre of music that they stole stuff from Led Zeppelin, right? And some of their creative process and what you're talking about of how do they absorb all these things. And that's what I always love about technology and music is it's not, there's always new stuff that's going to go make things better. Just because we did something a certain way before, yes, it's proven, but how do we do it faster, cheaper, more automated, because there's less qualified people to do this, and we've got to get to market faster and do things better. So that's why I love the cybersecurity business. But Phil, since you're the first guest, we'll go fantasy football style. You get 1, I get 2, you get 2, I get 1. We'll close it out. But what's your first song to tie back into medical device security?
So, so I'm going to pick When the Levee Breaks, right? Because in a cyber event, all hell breaks loose. That's the levee breaking, right? So it happens. I was just talking to a veterinarian the other day, and he was telling me his daughter works in New York in a SOC, right? And she had just spent a 12-hour day because when her phone went off at 5:30 in the morning, and they had an event, and she had to go in and figure out, what went on, right? What was the impact of what went on? Is it still going on? How do we limit the damage? How do we close the loop? How do we get them back into service, right? And that's the same thing. It's an emergency situation. We see it over and over again.
Awesome. So I'm going to take 2 in a row. Number 1, I'm going to take is Trampled Underfoot. So if we're not conscious about securing all the medical devices, you're going to get trampled underfoot because there will be an event. You talked about 2 of the major patient impacts with the ransomware event. People died. We don't want people to die. That's the number 1 thing. We don't want anybody compromised. And then I don't know, I got about 8 here, Phil. Your time is going to come. So it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So your time is going to come. That's one of the songs that I see from Led Zeppelin that tie into medical device security. So your time is going to come. I look at it in a more positive light. Your time is going to come when these things are going to show up secured versus we have no idea if it's secured. So I think that's the more positive wave this is going. Phil, you have two more tunes that tie back in from Led Zeppelin in the medical.
I got 2 more. So I'm going to pick Thank You, right? And I know Thank You is a love song, right? But the fact is we need to be thanking the people that are on the front lines each and every day for what they do, right? So thank you. Listen to that on the radio on the way to work or before you turn on your computer, and thank the people that are doing the job, that keep us safe, that keep innovating the products that we have, that keep us secure. Right. And the last one is I'll go with the Battle of Evermore, right? It's the classic battle of light and dark, right? And that's what we're sort of up against, right? The hackers and the attackers and the defenders, right? Of that. Needless to say, the beautiful mandolin interweaving with the guitar, the 2 vocalists, back and forth on this. It's a song that it's probably my favorite Led Zeppelin song, and I can't talk about Led Zeppelin without talking about the Battle of Evermore.
Yeah, and I love the cover of that from the single soundtrack by the Lovemongers. It's one of my favorites as well, Phil. You got to be in the mood, but the whole song and how they play that, it's really like I think the fillings in your teeth rattle. But it's awesome. I'll take one last one to close us out in this whole grand scheme of things. Communication breakdown. If there's communication breakdown, we talked a lot about, the shared responsibility or the lines of demarcation, who owns what, where it is. If everybody's upfront and honest about what they're responsible for, a lot more positive things get done and there's less risk and things get done to where there's no issue. So love that. I do want to throw one other cover I did find this morning, Phil. This is probably going to blend both of our eras, but I think she's one of the greatest singers, Rock and Roll. by Stevie Nicks.
Oh,
I did
yeah.
listen to it, and Stevie Nicks is one of the greatest voices of the '70s. And if she does a Led Zeppelin song, I mean, they probably party together, so it's pretty cool stuff. So
I love that. So Fleetwood Mac was my first concert. So
okay, yeah, that's fantastic. So all right, so Phil, I really appreciate you coming on. Look forward to catching up with you at the next Health ISAC conference. I can't remember when it is, but I think you guys do have a fall show. But
we do. It's the Fall Summit in San Antonio. I forget the dates. Late November, right?
Yeah, it's
so
late
absolutely looking
November,
forward
San
to
Antonio.
seeing you there, Jay. Absolutely, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. I've had a great time.
Hey, listen, thanks for tuning in. Listen, share it, like it, tell your friends, tell your mom, put the hammer down, the pedal to the metal, and thanks for tuning in.